It was 1989, and I just happened to look over to a couple that was sitting close to us in the restaurant, and they had this little pamphlet, and on the cover it said Venezuela. And I looked at the pamphlet and I said to Dan, why don't we go to Venezuela? And to be honest, I didn't know where Venezuela was at the time. I didn't know it was in South America. I didn't really know anything about it at all. It was, in some ways, a trip from hell. Other ways it was great. When we arrived late at night into Caracas, we had trouble trying to get our power chairs. And we didn't know till later the problem was that they didn't understand the concept of a power chair. And so they brought my manual chair first, and I kept asking, where's my power chair? And they were looking at me like I was crazy. So finally we convinced them that it wasn't a bomb, it was okay. And all of the staff at the airport, I had to instruct them how to put my wheelchair back together.
In Spanish?
In broken Spanish and English and interpreters, mostly sign language. We now have to figure out how to get from the airport to our resort, which I think was maybe 45-minute drive away. And because there were no accessible buses or taxis at that time, they decided that they were going to take my chair apart again, put it in the trunk of a car, and then physically lift myself and Dan into this car to drive us back to our resort. As we're barreling down the highway, because I don't have any balance, I fell over into the lap of the taxi driver. And I don't know what he was thinking, but he wasn't too pleased with this guy lying in his lap. And so from the back seat, my friends would keep pulling me back up, and then I'd keep falling back down. And the poor guy, and I didn't speak Spanish, and he didn't speak English. It was, it was very interesting. To find out the hotel was accessible, at that time I didn't really know all the questions to ask. But basically I just, wanted to make sure I could get in the room for one, and that I could get into the hotel. Were there any steps? It was accessible by accident, almost. It wasn't like they purposely, made the rooms wheelchair accessible or anything, but a lot of the structures there were one level anyway. And so I could pretty well get everywhere around the hotel. I could sit by the pool and, have drinks, and certainly, no quadriplegics had ever traveled, to this hotel in Venezuela. So I think they were more curious than anything. But certainly they were not resistant to answering questions. They were really quite good. So we get to the city, and the area I think was called the Sabana Grande or something like that. It's a city of millions and millions of people. And so as we're getting out of the taxi, the first thing, people started to watch this chair being put together. And then I remember getting in the chair and starting it, and people jumped back, like, oh, what's this? Like, because they didn't know what it was. So every time you would get to a corner, it was about more than a foot high. And so they literally have to lift my chair over. I would wheel across the street, and then they have to lift me back up to the next side, and we wheel to the next corner. So after doing this 2 or 3 times, my friends are pouring sweat, but we noticed that we started to get a crowd gathering. It started with maybe 4 or 5 people, but pretty soon it was 20, then 30, then 50. And then we had at least 200 people who were crowded around us, watching us as we were wheeling down the street. And at first I was getting kind of nervous. I didn't know, what was this about. But the people started just to come over, and they would touch my chair, and they would touch me, and they would jump back. I call them the stormtroopers. The military came. And there were these full black uniforms with black helmets. They had submachine guns with them. And they came over and they pointed their guns at us. And basically what they said to us, that we had to leave town. Now we hadn't shopped, we hadn't done anything. And they said we were creating a disturbance. And I said, but we're not doing anything, we just want to go shopping. And they said, it doesn't matter. We don't want people assembling on the streets, and obviously you're causing a problem. So, at gunpoint, they escorted us out of Caracas, right? So they took us right back to the edge of the city where we got in a taxi the first time. And at gunpoint, they made sure that our chairs were taken back apart, put back in the car, that we got in the car, and at gunpoint, we were forced to leave town. So I never got a chance to actually explore the city. Something you need to be aware of if you're going to travel, certainly to other countries, is that they may not be accustomed to seeing someone like me, in a power wheelchair in a little village somewhere. But overall, the people were fantastically friendly. We'd never seen a wheelchair the whole time we were in Venezuela. And we asked a few people, and they said that first off, there was no power chair. They'd never seen a power chair. So, secondly, there was a facility where people with disabilities were kept, and it was upstairs. And they were wheelchair users, but they didn't have wheelchairs. So they stayed in bed. So some of these people were 7, 8, 9 years upstairs in bed in this facility, not able to get out. And that's why you didn't see people with disabilities, or at least visible. I forget what time it was, but we arrived at the airport early just to be prepared. So everyone loads onto the plane, and we sat there. And we sat there, and we sat there for a long time. And then the doors to the plane opened after we taxied for 3 hours. And these stormtrooper guys came back again, and with these submachine guns. And I thought, oh my God, now what is it, right? So they come onto the plane, they start yelling and screaming in Spanish and pointing these machine guns at everyone. And they decide that they're taking everybody off the plane. Being paralyzed, weren't able to just get over our seats and get off the plane, but we couldn't explain that to these guys. So they're pointing these rifles at us. Everyone is gone except for us now and our 2 friends who are trying desperately to explain that they have to lift us off the plane and bring our wheelchairs. And but these guys weren't having anything to do with that. Luckily for us, I think it was a flight attendant or someone, intervened and explained to them our situation. So they lifted us out of the plane, they carried us into the airport and set us on benches in the airport. Now again, I have no balance, so I couldn't sit on the bench, so they took ropes and they tied me in. And there we sat for, I think, 5, 6 hours or something. When we finally get back to Canada, to Toronto actually, Pearson Airport I guess it was, we find out the full story. Apparently there had been some type of uprising in Venezuela, and they wanted to overtake the presidential palace and the airport or something. And we were the last plane to be allowed to leave the country. With all of the things that happened on that trip, we had an incredible time. It made me realize that in spite of the fact that I happened to be quadriplegic and I used a power wheelchair, I realized at that point that there was nothing to stop me from traveling, certainly by air. The people in Venezuela generally were incredible. They had an honest curiosity about me, and because I'm quite open-minded, I didn't have a problem answering their questions. And everyone at the hotel knew us. Everywhere I went, free drinks and food, and it was absolutely fantastic. As a matter of fact, I met my girlfriend at the time in Venezuela on that trip. She was from London, Ontario. I was from Nova Scotia. Ironically, we met in Venezuela. We were together for many, many years after that trip, and so that was a good thing. I got to experience new foods. I got to eat crawly things that I had no idea what they were. But I learned that you have to be open-minded. I really learned that accessibility is important, but that's not really the deal breaker. I mean, as long as you want to do something, you will always find a way to be able to do it. So it was, all in all, it was a fantastic trip. Que la prueba es mañanera y no puede fallar. Luego al back.